Hello, Mr. Rhodes.
Good morning. Thanks again for the invitation. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Yes, we shall start in a couple of minutes. There are still people in the queue waiting to be admitted.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I see lots of other speakers here. Ich bin gerade jetzt in Bayern, also viele Grüße.
You're not the only one in Bayern.
Oh, very nice, me too.
And we have Ambassador Nobilo in Brussels. Some of us are... So, I believe we can start now. Good morning to all of you and welcome to our hybrid roundtable discussion, The Future of Europe, the roundtable discussion that the Hans Seidel Foundation and the Institute for Development and International Relations are organizing together. With this roundtable discussion, we are continuing a series of discussions on the future of Europe and its role in the world. At the first event, we have discussed in depth the EU integration process of the Western Balkan countries and the role of the regional think tanks in that process. Today's discussion moves on to common defense and security policy and challenges to the EU role as a promoter of a rules-based global order. It will deal with issues of the EU's traditional levers and explore what could be the new ones, as well as the perspectives of transatlantic cooperation. So this is the range of issues to be tackled today. Unfortunately, there are some changes in today's program, as Ms. Norsic has informed us a couple of minutes ago. She's unfortunately stuck on an airport and she cannot join us on today's event. But nevertheless, we have a range of other distinguished speakers with us today, and I would like to thank them all. Mr. Seibel, Charge d'Affaires from the German Embassy in Zagreb, Ambassador Nobilo, Permanent Representative of the Republic of Croatia to the NATO, and last but not least, Mr. Matthew Rhodes, professor from the George Marshall Center for Security Studies in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. I hope it is going to be a very vivid and interesting discussion, and we are looking forward to hear not only from our distinguished speakers today, but also from our audience. You can pose a question at any time in the chat box, or you can raise a hand and ask the question. I would also like to greet our students from the Faculty of Political Science, which are present with us live here in the Hotel Sheraton in Dubrovnik. But first of all, I would like to ask Dr. Klaus Fiesinger, our representative and regional director for Southeast Europe from the Hans Seidel Foundation, to give you a welcome speech, and then Mr. Sandro Knezovic, research advisor from the Institute for Development and International Relations, will take over the moderation. Thank you all. Mr. Fiesinger, please, the floor is yours.
My thanks are going to the organizers. That means concretely to the Institute of Development and International Relations, represented by my colleague Sandro Knezovic. He will speak also to us. And of course, to my colleagues in the Zagreb office. My thanks are going also to all speakers and panelists of this conference. And so it's a special pleasure and honor that Mr. Seibel from the German Embassy is among us. The future of Europe and the role of European Union in the world. This is today the point of discussion, and we of course are aware that the European Union is only one of several players in these international affairs. European Union foreign and defense policy have some regional and some global aspect. Both of them we are discussing today. And as you know, both focus points are already declared in the Lisbon Treaty. European Union has faced in the last years with many challenges challenges. You all of them know about this, and so I don't need to enumerate them, but only let me mention that the complexity of decision-making process within the EU is as difficult as the growing systematic competitions with other actors, the so-called non-Western powers, as we notice it in the Balkans, Russia, China, Turkey, Saudi Arabia. Even more necessary is it in this context to have some harmonizing approach between European Union and the US administration. And so I suppose that the NATO representative, Mr. Nobilo, and the representative of the George Marshall Center, Mr. Roth, will give us today some more concrete insight about the present level of this transatlantic cooperation. Croatia is one of the EU member states. It is a small state, but undertakes many efforts to share the responsibilities within European Union, but also beyond. And as Mrs. Markic already mentioned it, let me also add that we published together with IRMO several studies about the role of Croatia in international affairs. The last one appeared at the beginning of this year, Croatia and the Schengen topic. And so I hoped that in today's keynote speech, we will just learn more about. But as I understood, Mrs. Markic, the representative is still missing. But despite of this, I think we have really some very interesting 2 hours in front of us. And so I will give back now to the moderator. Thank you very much. Hvala vam na pažnji.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Fiesinger, for your input. On my own behalf and on behalf of the Institute for Development and International Relations, let me join Mrs. Markic Boban in cordially welcoming you to this event. At the very beginning, let me thank Dr. Fiesinger and Mrs. Markic Boban for very fruitful cooperation. This event is just a display of continuation of our cooperation in present and in the future. A traditional and fruitful cooperation between IRMA and Hans Eidel Stiftung is a well-known fact in the wider region of Southeast Europe and beyond. And for many years we are covering a wide range of topics that are relevant not only for the region of Southeast Europe, but for the European Union and transatlantic community as well. Both as EU citizens and professionals, we are dedicated to the process of development of EU policies in different fields. This is precisely the reason why we decided to concentrate during the entire year of 2021 on the debate about the future of Europe that is actually shaping the political discourse in the EU. What are the reasons for that? Why is that so? I would argue that today's world is characterized by increasing uncertainty and unpredictability at both domestic and international level. A growing number of players are now engaged in influencing processes and shaping outcomes worldwide. For roughly two decades, this has been a responsibility of the West, driven by its values, but also by its interests and means. But now, others have emerged too. There are influential countries with a strong sentiment towards the concept of national sovereignty, but there are also other more authoritarian actors endowed with sizable means, like China, the Gulf states, and of course Russia. And nota bene, these countries are championing the defense spending over the course of last 10 or 20 years. So contrary to 10 or 20 years ago, there are now many competing narratives at work in the EU and in the wider transatlantic community. And the post-Cold War liberal international order is obviously being increasingly challenged. It has been often presented as a Western construct primarily serving exclusively Western interests, and equally contested has been the concept of ever closer union. All this contributes to the growing sense of uncertainty and fragility in our time. The Union's enlargement capacity along its most successful policy has reached critical juncture for at least two reasons. First of all, due to fatigue about EU enlargement in the EU itself, but also by facing a very difficult and unconsolidated candidate and potential candidate states. EU's sui generis nature and variety of foreign policy cultures and interests it encompasses is definitely a richness in itself. However, it does not help in creating effective and timely decision-making procedures that are needed in contemporary international environment. On top of all this, the Union is also confronted with significant worsening of its immediately security environment. Whether you look east or south, in more concrete terms, to the countries of Eastern Partnership or MENA region, the environment is being increasingly complicated not only by the development on the ground, but also by meddling of other aforementioned big players. This is the environment in which the European Union has to rethink its current position, its 7 decades of gradual development from the period of European coal and steel community to its contemporary efforts to build and cement its position as a relevant global player. The debate about the future of Europe has many layers, since different policies of the European Union affect the lives of its citizens and of others around the globe. It ranges from green agenda to manageable economic growth and rational social inclusion. However, there is no doubt that the role of the EU in the world, in other words, the CFSP aspect of this story, is of utmost importance. This precisely is the reason why IRMO, together with Hans Seidel Stiftung, decided to launch the debate about the future of Europe with this topic and with such a distinctive group of panelists. Again, I warmly welcome all panelists, and without any further ado, in order to be rational with time, I would like to immediately pass the floor to Mr. Harald Seiber, Chargé d'Affaires of the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany to the Republic of Croatia, with the topic EU in the World, Challenges and Perspectives. Mr. Seiber, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Knežević. I would also like to welcome the co-panelists and all guests and visitors to this conference. Of course, I would like to start by thanking the IRMO and the Hans Seidel Foundation for organizing this valuable and important conference, which personally I think comes at the very right time. I would like to embark on the inner state of play of the European Union, which I think plays an important role when it comes to its role worldwide, its role in the transatlantic relations, and in many other contexts. So, talking about challenges the EU is currently facing, I think it's not easy because the growing number of complex and critical issues dealt with in Brussels and by member states is significant, and I think they even give us reason to be concerned. Internally, the EU has to take care not to run the risk of losing reputation and trust among its citizens. The decision-making process is often criticized as being too slow and not transparent enough. Communication with the population, I think, needs to be improved because people sometimes do not feel properly informed about decisions taken by the European institutions. Many people claim that the role and the power of the European Parliament must be further strengthened. Against the background of the complexity of regional and global topics which need to be addressed, just to mention some of them, climate change, environment protection, post-pandemic recovery, social coherence, migration, or the worrying number of crises all over the world, we are becoming witness of increasingly diverging opinions among member states on how to best deal with them. Sometimes the Union even finds itself confronted with discussions in which ideological points of view prevail over compromise. It seems to be getting more and more difficult to find the right balance between legitimate national interests on the one hand and common goals pursued by the EU as a whole in the interest of its citizens on the other. If the EU does not want to suffer division and serious harm from inside, I think it needs to find ways to better cope with this situation. The conference on the future of Europe, which was launched on the Day of Europe, celebrated on 9th of May 2021, wants to make a serious attempt to take stock of the attitude European citizens have concerning the functioning of the European institutions and to invite them to express their views and to present proposals with regard to improving and strengthening the EU. For the next 12 months, this conference offers a unique opportunity to all Europeans to raise their voice, to make their contributions, and to actively participate in the shaping of a better, more efficient, and even stronger union. Ladies and gentlemen, I think generally speaking, the EU is based on diversity in many different terms. We all agree on that. However, fundamentally diverging opinions always bear the risk that the EU becomes a target of external powers that seek to split the Union in order to prevent decisions against them, to pursue interests that are not in line with EU policies, or to weaken the political power and influence of the Union as a whole. This in particular, therefore it is essential that the EU and its member states speak out with one single voice. This in particular applies to the common foreign and security policy. The number of challenges in this important area is overwhelming. How to deal with difficult international partners, authoritarian heads of state, or countries that try to destabilize the international political order and who do not even refrain from breaching international law. How to guarantee Europe and its citizens peace and security in a world that is getting more and more aggressive. Where does the EU see its place when it comes to defense policy and the realignment of its relations with NATO? What will the new transatlantic relations look like, and which principles will they be based on? How to reshape relations between the EU and neighboring continents like Africa or Asia and even Latin America? The answer to these questions lies in a common approach and in a single voice. No EU member state has the power to solve any of the prevailing problems and conflicts on its own. We are all much too small. The EU, and we all as its members, must find a way to speak with a single voice more effectively and more efficiently than in the past, bringing about a single and shared Europe. Most recently, the EU has proven that it is capable of doing so. We should remember that. The successful conclusion of the negotiations on the multi-annual framework 2021 to 27, the agreement on the European Recovery and Resilience Programme, or Next Generation EU, the coordination of our efforts to contain the corona pandemic, the concerted action with regard to the COVID-19 vaccination campaign and free traveling within Europe, and last but not least, the unanimous condemnation of the unacceptable rerouting and forced landing of a Ryanair flight to Minsk by Belarus are impressive examples of a strong, unanimous, and substantial action and reaction of the EU. These examples should encourage all governments and all political decision makers convinced of the European idea to continue seeking common ground within the EU and working for more consensus among its member states. In this context, I think it's worth remembering that the EU was originally founded as a peace project. Having maintained peace for more than 70 years is most probably the biggest achievement the EU can be proud of. The same applies to freedom. The hard-won freedom and sovereignty of its members in Central and Eastern Europe could in fact only be preserved in a bigger union with a leverage. It is our foremost duty to continue preserving peace and freedom, as we need to continue promoting other core values the EU stands for. We're talking about the rule of law, freedom of speech, human rights, free market economy, prosperity and social security among its citizens, just to mention a few of them. I think, and I'm convinced that all of us agree on that, it is worth fighting for these ideas and defending them against any kind of interference from outside. If we, the member states, manage to keep closely together in pursuing our common goals, the EU and its institutions will become more powerful and even gain stronger and more significant influence in the future for the benefit of our citizens. If not, the EU and we as member states will seek a weakening of our political influence, which will definitely not only be detrimental to governments, but also to the disadvantage of people in Europe. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Seibel. I found your presentation very inspiring. However, I have to be rational with time, so I will pick up only a couple of points that I really deem fundamental, or the most important messages that should be taken away. First of all, recognizing the fact that the EU is coping with the growing number of issues, and recognizing the fact that it's not that easy to combine EU's complexity and decision-making process as it is with the challenge of a growing number of issues. The fact that you underline that EU has to find a way to better cope with the current issues, and that this framework, which is called the future of Europe, is a big opportunity, I found very important indeed. And perhaps the number one message is that the EU has to speak with one voice, knowing that this is easier said than done. If there is no synergy, I find it very difficult for the EU to cement its position at the international scale unless it attempts to speak with one voice. And of course, last but not the least, the fact that you have underlined that EU's duty is to protect its fundamental values within the EU and beyond, regardless of existing challenges. I'm quite sure that your presentation will provoke many questions and comments during the Q&A session. In order to be able to time-wise organize Q&A session, I will immediately pass the floor to His Excellency Dr. Mario Nobilo, who is a permanent representative of the Republic of Croatia to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in Brussels, with the topic, the perspectives of transatlantic cooperation. Your Excellency, we are very grateful that you managed to share that you managed your time to join us, and that you were willing to share a couple of your thoughts and ideas about this interesting topic with us. Thank you very much indeed, and please take the floor.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really glad to have opportunity to work again with the Hans Ziedler Stiftung in Zagreb and elsewhere. We used to do it a lot when I was also in NIRMO and also in the Foreign Ministry. So I'm glad that for those who are attending today virtually or in other way, that we have opportunity to exchange views on this transatlantic perspective and the wider role of Europe in the changing world. And in that respect, let me start by saying that the world had changed in the meantime. Of course, the fact is that it is a multipolar world, and we have not only rising China, more asserting though declining Russia, but also Russia-China partnership, which is very pragmatic and is based on the formula that not always together, but never against each other. So we have new realities in the world, which is pointing to the necessity to revisit the transatlantic bond that exists between Europe and Northern America. And also the common issue here is that we are fighting for the rule of law, and that is the entire legal system which we developed for decades, and also indirectly we are fighting authoritarian regimes who are trying to challenge it with their own rules and selfish national interests. And of course, there's also another phenomena on security issues in particular, that it is so hard to reach consensus in UN Security Council, and therefore this what NATO does provides a certain international legitimacy to the undertakings by international community in crisis management, in fighting terrorism, and in other security issues that we are facing. There is also another fact of life, and that is, it's not new actually, but it's strengthening, namely the US pivot to Pacific. It's very clear because of the challenge that China provides, and also opportunity, if you like. It's more challenge than opportunity. And because of other geopolitical reasons, US has put pivot on its Pacific policy, and essentially is not abandoning Europe, but that puts Europe in a new role and position. This is why NATO, and I'm talking now as someone who is dealing with NATO daily, has to undergo reforms, planned to be launched in 2 weeks by a summit, but then followed by the summit 2022, which will specify all those reforms, and they are supposed to respond to those wider changes in the world around us. Multipolarity, as I said, is a reality. It's not a tendency. We are already there. We have to restructure our views on the world and adjust to those challenges. For that reason, NATO is willingly getting global. It still remains focused on Northern Atlantic security issues, but the threats that come to NATO come also from a wider area, namely terrorism, hybrid, and cyber. Also, space can be already is a domain from which our communications and weapons of mass destruction can threaten us, and also use of artificial energy. Then we are global also because of the growing piracy, underwater cables and energy connections that we have to protect, and generally any line of communication and shipment. There is another element why we are getting global, and that is the climate change. The melting ice had provided not only opportunity to open the northern route, but also there is a growing militarization of the high north, which possesses certain threats to Northern Atlantic safety. Also, we see that the existing systems of treaties on weapons of mass destructions are collapsing. Countries are withdrawing for various reasons from them, and there is a need to renew some of them, but also to make the new ones being more global and try to take it out of US-Russian context, make them truly global. I would also add here that it's great to have America back in NATO. They, of course, never withdrew, but there was a difficult period when some leaders were questioning the future of NATO. America's back and leading NATO. It is felt very strongly in the preparation of this summit in 2 weeks. And we are facing new realities. There is a renewal of Cold War. There are new threats, as I just described, and we need to strengthen our defense and deterrence. And above all, we have to join hands across the Atlantic to cope with the technological changes that multipolar world creates to us. It's not G5 or G6. It goes beyond that because it looks like in some areas West is losing technological edge. There is more talks now these days, not only about readiness and how to better finance it, but also about the resilience of our society. Civil and military cooperation is necessary to make our societies more resilient, not only in case of war, but also in case of pandemics, natural disasters, and also to face hybrid and cyber threats. Now we come to the point when we have to ask ourselves how strong this European pillar should be within NATO, or there is a possibility that Europe can be more self-sufficient or even have a strategic autonomy. Overwhelming majority NATO believes it cannot. It's not only because of a nuclear umbrella that is provided mainly by the US, but also France and Britain, but because of geography and also the fact that China and Russia security threat to Europe, in addition to terrorism, which we suffered all those years, and cyber and hybrid challenges that we go through. And the answer to that question is, well, Europe has to take more responsibility and work together on issues like military mobility. There should be some kind of division of work when it comes to new technologies, communications and all that, when West is losing this edge. But also there is an understanding that without American backing, Europe is too exposed to be strategically self-sufficient and to look as a military power that can set certain rules in its own vicinity. And let me also say that expectations that we have from the forthcoming summit are rising high. But this tendency that we have to approach the reforms within NATO in all its domains and aspects, political, military, civilian, has been there with us as world was changing around us. There was a kind of setbacks, or we lost a couple of years. Essentially, we are aware that those reforms would happen even without the change of leadership in Washington and are badly needed. There would be new ideas, new mechanisms, new tools to face security challenges together across the Atlantic. And it's also clear that US and Europe have so many other issues where they have to work together. It's not only security, which is essential, but also they have to finalize their economic deals and also, as I explained, work on technological edge, fight together for the preservation of the rule-based international order. Also the whole complex of human rights issue and others aspects of holding together in the changing world. I'll stop here. I was probably picturing this transatlantic bond more from the NATO perspective, but I'm sure that the other interlocutors would shed more light on the EU dimension of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Nobilo. Thanks for highlighting a couple of very important points that will be more than relevant for our future debate for this topic, but especially for our Q&A session. The first that I can pick up is the fact that we are living in a multipolar world, and this is actually a new reality. And that the US has pivoted to Pacific, facing China and other challenges, which puts Europe in a different position. Thanks also for reminding us of the fact that there are geostrategic reshuffling going on in the higher north with the ice melting in the Arctic, and with the new route opening and with the high level of militarization of the new geostrategic hotspot on the globe that is going to shape not only political but also economic affairs between Asia and Europe. And of course for reminding us that we are also facing new tensions between the East and the West, and of the fact that actually there's no other way but to additionally invest into building synergy on two shores of the Atlantic to be able to jointly face contemporary challenges. Thank you very much indeed, and I'm very much looking forward to reflections on your presentation during the Q&A session. And without any further ado, I'm passing the floor to a dear friend and a colleague, Professor Matthew Rhodes from George C. Marshall Center for Security Studies in Garmisch-Partenkirchen in Germany, a very prominent expert on international security and NATO-related affairs, and a colleague who has always been responsive to our events. And again, he decided to join us, for which we are very, very grateful. Matthew, we are very much grateful for the fact that you are with us, at least in the virtual mode, and we are very much looking forward to listening to your ideas and thoughts about the topic, the EU and US in a contemporary world, a view from the United States. Matt, please, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much, Sandro, for the invitation to join this distinguished panel and to continue the very good cooperation both with IRMO and with the Seidel Foundation, which my colleagues at the Marshall Center and I have enjoyed. I will present a view from the United States as an American citizen, but for truth in advertising, I should admit that I'm actually based in southern Bavaria, in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. But I think I am following, given my citizenship and my work with the Marshall Center, very closely the approach of the Biden administration to these issues and the way that the United States has dealt with them for some years. And to start off, with my focus, I'll try to refer, as Ambassador Nobillo did, to these upcoming summit meetings. In 2 weeks, President Joe Biden will make his first international trip as president. He'll be coming to Europe for a series of 4 summits, starting off with the G7 summit in Great Britain, continuing, as we've just heard, on June 14th to Brussels for a summit with other NATO leaders. Then on the following day, a summit with the EU on June 15th, and finally on June 16th, traveling to Geneva, Switzerland to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin. So you have a historic set of meetings coming up, significant also because they're the first of the Biden presidency. And I think there is a sense, given the topic of today's panel, that this summit meeting in the middle, the one with European Union leaders, will somehow get overshadowed by the others. It will not seem as dramatic, maybe not as sexy in media terms as a big meeting with Vladimir Putin, or some discussion of things like the future of NATO's strategic concept. But I think that would be a mistake to overlook it. In fact, I will try to discuss over the next 10 minutes or so a number of reasons why it is important, both that it's taking place and what it might or might not deliver. And so we should not let it get lost in this week of other meetings that is coming up. And I think one of the first reasons it's a significant summit is that it's a result of an almost extraordinary paper by the European Commission and High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy that was released at the beginning of December last year. This paper, which you can find on the EU website, is called A New EU Agenda for Global Change. It's a 12-page document, relatively short. And while organizations or national governments are not the most literature, the not most interesting things to read at the beach during the summer or something like that, a couple of aspects of this report stand out. One is that it's quite blunt on the very first page about what it calls a once-in-a-generation opportunity to strengthen transatlantic relations to face the kinds of global challenges the other speakers have been talking about. And it specifically ties this to the upcoming arrival at that time of a new presidential administration in the United States. And while it doesn't criticize the former President Trump by name, it talks about strained relations over recent years and the problem with unilateral policies that have made it more difficult for transatlantic cooperation to go forward. So it talks about this once in a generation opportunity. And if we think of a generation in terms of time of being 25 or 30 years, that is a long time. It's roughly the time of Croatia's current independence as a state. It's probably a bit older than even some of the people attending there at the Sheraton in Zagreb. So this is a historic opportunity. And in the last paragraphs of the document, it calls for a EU-US summit in the first half of 2021 as the right opportunity to launch this new agenda and the strengthened transatlantic partnership. So it was a very deliberate, very public, somewhat blunt result of this initiative by the EU after Joe Biden's election last year. And I think the second reason that this is a significant summit coming up in 2 weeks is that the US side accepted this invitation. You could say that part of this was just being polite. Part of it was that it's an easy invitation to accept because you're going to be in town for the NATO meeting anyway. It doesn't hurt to stay one more night in Brussels. But I think there's more to it than that. And it's in that context perhaps worth reflecting a little bit on the historical ambivalence of the US approach towards the European Union and towards European integration. On the one hand, the US historically has been a very strong supporter of such integration, going back to the time of the Marshall Plan in the late 1940s. The idea is basically that a strong Europe that is internally integrated and able to provide stability for itself and its immediate neighborhood is, in geopolitical terms, the best form of burden sharing. It makes it easier for the United States to focus on other problems in different parts of the world, to deal with issues that it has domestically at home. And so more Europe is better. Of course, in this formulation, there's always a second side. And the other hand here is that there has always been a kind of a nagging doubt among many American policymakers that Europe was really up to the job. That especially when it comes to security matters, there was a sense that often the EU and its predecessors have kind of lacked the political will, the unity, and sometimes the necessary tools to really get the job done, to maintain stability, to address crises around its periphery, and so that the US has to keep playing a role. And there's a concern even that the efforts sometimes by the EU to strengthen its capabilities in these areas may in the end only divert time, attention, and resources from more specifically transatlantic ones, such as the NATO alliance. And so that the fear is that you end up weakening NATO or the transatlantic tools without really replacing them with something effective that can fill the gap in their place. So you have this kind of ambivalence historically. And during the last 4 years of the Trump administration, sometimes this ambivalence crossed over into outright public hostility. You had some often quoted comments by President Trump that he saw the EU as a foe and an enemy, that the European Union was only an instrument of Germany, and that in effect it was in trade practice, quote, worse than China. So in many ways you had this kind of a very tense, critical relationship. And of course, that's the background for a lot of the language in the EU document that I referred to. But while the Trump kind of approach was maybe extreme in the US historical context, in thinking about a summit next month, it's worth remembering that it was not the Trump presidency, but the Obama presidency, in which Joe Biden was the vice president, that ended the recent practice of regular US-EU summits. President Obama did participate in one such summit back in 2009 in Prague, around the time that he gave this speech on ending nuclear weapons in the world. But he did not want to repeat that the following year. And there was a minor diplomatic controversy over his decision to skip a planned EU summit in Spain in the spring of 2010. On the one hand, he had just, I think, concluded that the meeting in Prague with EU leaders had not been very substantive or productive. And on the other, during this time in between, the EU had ratified the Lisbon Treaty and adopted, from an American perspective, an even more complex decision-making procedure than existed before. And so the prospect of traveling to Spain or to Europe to meet with 3 different EU presidents, I think, was just too much for the Obama White House staff to figure out. And so they thought it would be better just to focus on other kinds of activities. And so since that time, since 2009, there has not been a US-EU summit, with the partial exception of a virtual summit the end of March in which President Biden also participated. So this is a major kind of breakthrough after a dozen years of a revived US decision to accept a EU summit. In part, why this change beyond just being polite? Well, in part, I think it reflects some changes in US thinking about foreign policy that mirror what we've heard from the other speakers. That there's a sense that you can no longer just take for granted US leadership or the superiority of democratic systems in dealing with global challenges. And if you look at how this is articulated in a formal document that the Biden administration has released, it's so-called interim national security strategic guidance, a kind of a draft national security strategy. It puts the focus throughout the document on what it calls reviving democracy. Proving that democratic countries are able to meet the needs of their citizens and able to work together effectively to meet the challenges of the 21st century better than their authoritarian competitors. Again, back in the 1990s, there might not have been much doubt that was the case. Now I think it's very much at least open for debate, including for reasons of internal challenges our countries are facing. And so that's one reason to be more open to cooperation in this format, also with key democratic allies in Europe. And the second, I think, is that the nature of many of these, new or newish security challenges that we're talking about, things like climate change, things like emerging technologies, are things in which the EU's relative advantages and strengths come to the fore. It may not be an overwhelming military power, but it is very strong as a normative and regulatory power. And in these ways, it's an especially effective and desirable partner for the United States in dealing with the challenges. And so that, I think, is why, especially for the Biden administration, there is a great interest in pursuing this offer, this invitation to build a new agenda for dealing with global change. That said, I think the third thing that we need to be looking at while this summit takes place and to see what comes afterwards is that it's really a chance to see what, in practical terms, the possibilities are. By coincidence, the summit will take place on the same day as my 30th wedding anniversary. And while I am very happy and lucky in my marriage, as others of you who might be married can attest, the honeymoon period of a relationship is basically over after 5 or 6 months. And the same thing is probably true for new political administrations. And so while in some ways this summit will be the fulfillment and culmination of the desire to look at the opportunities for a new EU-US agenda, it's also kind of the end of the beginning. It's the end of this kind of easy honeymoon phase where you can be relieved that there's been a change, where you can be optimistic and hopeful that something will result from it. And it's a period where you have to start looking more concretely about what really can be done. Can these aspirations be translated into real policy achievements, real changes from what's going on before? And here, if you look back over the last 5 or 6 months since the document was released, the picture is very much mixed. You can see some very optimistic, hopeful signs. You can see a relaxation of some tensions and disputes regarding trade. You can see some convergence in terms of regulation of social media and technology companies, including international taxation. And in the defense field, you can even see, I think, an important agreement for the United States to participate as a so-called third country in the European Union PESCO project on military mobility, a subject that Ambassador Nobilo also mentioned in his remarks. So there are some positive signs. However, on the downside, if you look at those issues which have been identified as of the highest priority, the initial results are more disappointing. And I will start here, I guess, with cooperation on COVID-19, which I think for both Europe and the United States remains the most immediate concern, even while conditions are improving on both sides of the Atlantic. And here we saw, I think, in the first months of 2021, still a lot of divergence in terms of whether the United States would share some of its vaccines or raw materials for the production of vaccines with its European partners, whether it would even allow some of the vaccines that had been purchased and were being produced for the U.S. market within plants in the EU to be diverted back to the EU, which was facing even higher rates of infection, created diplomatic disputes. And more recently, there has been real divergence in terms of how to go about providing more international distribution of vaccines beyond the EU and US to countries like India and others that are seeing spikes. The U.S. proposed a waiver of intellectual property rights, somewhat surprising the EU, and which the EU has opposed. EU leaders have instead kind of talked more about strengthening and formalizing some of the bodies within the World Health Organization to deal with these vaccine issues in the future, with opposition from the United States. So I think it's very important that the summit next month be used to try to coordinate more closely the way that dealing with COVID-19 and with the vaccine issues will be prolonged. The second big issue, and maybe the biggest one, not just now, but over the longer term, is something we've heard a lot about already, and this is the issue of China. About the same time as this EU paper was released, there were a number of other think tank reports also calling for a new transatlantic agenda. One of them in Germany was called in German transatlantic Traut-euch, and translated as kind of more transatlantic ambition, please. And one of the contributing authors was the Seidel Foundation expert, Andrea Rother. It called the China issue the so-called fulcrum point for future EU-US relations, a geometric term that this was going to really be the most central point around which all the other issues would eventually depend. And here, at least, the initial results were, I think, disappointing even before the Biden administration took office. And this was the conclusion at the end of last year, during Germany's EU presidency, of the trade and investment agreement with China. Despite the fact that even the incoming Biden administration officials, such as National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, were openly calling for delay and an opportunity to discuss this before it was concluded. Now, in fairness, the contents of this document are not so terrible, or at least not so different from what the Trump administration itself signed with China in early 2020 in terms of intellectual property rights, investment rules, and so forth. But the idea that just a few weeks after this EU paper came out calling for more US-EU cooperation and coordination on issues, including with China, that the EU moved ahead in a different direction, in some ways raised questions in Washington about whether the EU was really serious, about whether this was, again, just kind of a rhetorical call for cooperation, but not one that would lead to actual cooperation in practice. Now, in the interim, there may be some more hopeful signs for this. It may be that the fact that China has imposed sanctions, including on members of the European Parliament, will block the Parliament from ratifying that agreement and allow a chance for reconsideration. But it started off, I think, on at least a skeptical note in Washington. And so I think it's important that next month, on the 15th of June, this meeting, to the extent you can do this within a few hours, leads to some tangible results. That perhaps it both leads to some policy decisions and some considerations of the EU proposals for new policy frameworks, such as a Trade and Technology Council or an US-EU defense and security dialogue, these things perhaps would be helpful, but it's important that it be more productive and more useful than the last US-EU summit in Prague 12 years ago, because otherwise, if this is really a once-in-a-generation opportunity, it could be 12 years or even 30 years before the next such summit took place. Thanks for the attention, and I look forward to the discussion during the question and answer session.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Rhodes, for your really inspiring presentation, providing us with an update on US-EU relations. I mean, in more practical terms, of US perception of developments in EU-related policies. Thanks for reminding us of the fact that in 2 weeks there's going to be a first President Biden's trip abroad, and this will be the NATO summit, the G7, and meeting with President Putin, and the fact that this meeting will somehow overshadow the meeting with other EU leaders. And this, to a certain extent, is reflective of the notion that has been there for quite many years about the U.S. perspective of the EU integration process and the U.S. perspective of the leverage of the EU at the global scale. The fact that you have practically shown us the Obama's administration approach towards EU-US summit is also very telling about Washington's pragmatic approach to international affairs and the way it analyzes potential partners and their leverage. So obviously there's going to be a lot of issues on the agenda. It's promising to hear that there are general trends of relaxation in post-Trump era, especially when we speak about trade and the potentials for cooperation within the wider framework of PESCO. And of course, thank you also for highlighting the things that are still on the table and that are potentially problematic, such as the compromise on the international distribution of COVID vaccines and the issue of China. The issue of China is something that is obviously number one on the US agenda, regardless of the ideological background of the US administration in position. And this is, of course, also increasingly relevant for the EU affairs. So it's going to be a very interesting thing to analyze in the period to come, how the attitude towards growing China, a more assertive China, will actually formulate the EU-US relations, or potentially where there'll be a possibility to develop a joint approach towards rising China. Anyways, I would like to close by thanking all three panelists, and of course now we are approaching the most interesting part, and this is the Q&A session, and I'm quite sure that all three presentations will spark interest for debate. I'm opening the floor with kind request to introduce yourself in a couple of words and have brief and concise questions or comments. Thank you very much indeed. The floor is open. Do we have any questions or comments online? If not, may I misuse the position of a moderator to ask a question to Professor Rhodes? Analyzing US-EU relations over the last couple of decades, I actually found the fact that there are certain points of coherence that are there regardless of momentum in international affairs and regardless of political background of political elites in position in Washington and US. Do you think that there will be a couple of points, at least the basic values, that are unquestioned in the period to come? And will this be a solid base or a fertile ground for bridging the gaps that have been developed during the last 10 years in fundamental issues or lack of capacity to gain compromises on two shores of the Atlantic? Thank you.
No, thanks again, Sandro. And the normal cop-out answer is it depends. I think one thing that will maybe get more attention and perhaps can be a kind of a guiding principle that maintains the relationship despite differences is this greater attention by political leaders on both sides to the importance of the vitality of democracy internally in their countries or continents, as well as between them. I mean, democracy has been a big theme in U.S. foreign policy with relative differences in emphasis for about 100 years since Woodrow Wilson and the First World War. But I think is what's different now for the Biden administration and many of its top officials is this idea that it has to really be proven and improved at home in the United States and internally with its key partners. And that this is a necessary aspect for the long-term success of our societies and for the long-term ability of our countries to continue to shape the international security environment and the types of ways we operate technologically and economically and socially without ceding that authority to China or other authoritarian powers. So I think this kind of renewed recognition of the importance of strengthening democracy both internally and abroad can be a kind of a guiding principle that provides glue. But that inevitably raises the questions and the challenges, the devil's in the details. What does that mean exactly in terms of how you interact with non-democratic countries? What types of trade relations are appropriate? What types are dangerous? How do you come to a kind of a common consensus on internal frameworks or rules for some of these emerging technologies, for artificial intelligence, even for existing things like social media? Can we come to a kind of consensus when there are different economic interests on the two sides of the Atlantic? So I think it's an opportunity to revive, to give kind of an updated focus to the transatlantic relationship, but it will require some difficult decisions and compromises on both sides to really reach consensus.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Rhodes. We have a question in the audience here, please.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I have a few questions for Professor Rhodes. So the first question is, you mentioned relations between the EU and China. Do you think that EU's relation toward China is sincere? As you mentioned, in December last year, we had the EU reached this point on CAI, on Comprehensive Agreement on Investments. It was not ratified, but on the one hand, they want to strengthen the relationship with relations with the transatlantic relations, and on the other side, we see that exports from Europe, especially from Germany, they're growing to China. Investments are growing. So I would say the economic ties are getting better even during this COVID-19 pandemic. So do you see sort of, unsincere relation when it comes to the way that EU treats China? Number two, there was recent news that the US is not going to pursue sanctions against Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Do you see it as a major change toward, American approach toward Russians in a way that trying to sort of appease these relations in terms of getting bigger pressure even from the Russian side toward China as the major foe and in the 21st century and in the third decade instead of Russia? And number three, announcements of sanctioning Ukrainian politicians because of, so to say, colluding with the Trump administration and Rudy Giuliani. Do you think that this is inappropriate sort of pressure in the time when Ukraine, as a vital American ally in Eastern Europe, is facing pressure on Russian border, and now the U.S. is sanctioning Ukrainian friends and allies? Thank you.
Okay, three tough questions, and I'll also look forward to the perspectives of the other speakers. I mean, first of all, on your question, I would not go so far as to say that the EU approach to China is insincere. I think, like the U.S. itself, like other countries, the EU, Germany, France, other members, try to find a balance of economic interest and long-term political principles. It's difficult always to say exactly how to make that balance, where to draw the line, but I would not say that somehow it's dishonest or insincere. I think one thing that may be happening across Europe as well as the U.S. in regard to China in particular, that may shift us, I hope, closer together, is the sense of where the medium to longer term economic interests are with China. Certainly there is an immediate interest in being able to sell into this very large, lucrative Chinese market. And it's important in ways I understand. Living here in Germany for some of the major German corporations, it's a big part of their global sales, a big part of their profits, a big part of how they maintain their international profitability and viability in ways that provides jobs and benefits for thousands of workers in Germany and elsewhere. So that's important. That's natural that countries think about that. But I think there's a growing wariness that some of the medium to long-term effects are that China, because of its lack of respect for intellectual property, for some of the pressure it puts on companies to do business inside of China, may mean that it is stealing future markets, future technologies in ways that would hurt also German or other EU industries. So I think that that may shift, I hope, or at least open opportunities for a more coordinated, complementary approach by the U.S. and the EU in its trade and regulatory relations with China. On Nord Stream, as I understand it, and this is a favorite topic for any discussions in which both Germans and Americans are present about the EU or transatlantic relations, I don't think it's a major change in the U.S. approach towards Russia. As I understand, it's at least a 90-day suspension of the parts of the congressionally mandated sanctions on Nord Stream that would apply to the German partners participating in this. The Russian ones are still subject. I think there is a hope by the Biden administration that this summit with President Putin in Geneva will be productive, at least in terms of what President Biden has said, and in terms of bringing in some so-called guardrails to the relationship. He is saying it is not a reset. And again, perhaps for historical interest, Vice President Biden back in 2009 was the first person to use this term reset at the Munich Security Conference at the beginning of 2009. But he says we're not trying to do another one of those. We're just trying to establish some areas, perhaps especially in the cyber field, beyond which the two sides will not go in targeting each other and damaging each other's interest. I think there are certainly people in the United States, including our former Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, who holds open this idea that perhaps Russia can be an ally against China and that kind of split them from the kind of relationship that Ambassador Nobilo described. But I think that goes beyond at least the immediate aspirations of the Geneva meeting. And in terms of Ukraine, again, in terms of allowing some sanctions against select Ukrainian politicians, I don't see that as, at least as viewed in Washington, as something that's downgrading the level of support for Ukraine. I think it is seen as something that is not a political decision or political process, but it's something that is perhaps recognizing that some of the individuals involved were violating campaign rules, were engaged in what, in retrospect, this administration in particular would see as inappropriate efforts to manipulate U.S. policy, including the position of the former American ambassador in Ukraine. So I don't think this is a lessening of or major change in the U.S. relationship with that country.
Thank you very much. Do we have more questions, please, Alexandra?
I would like to thank all the speakers for their really inspiring statements. I would like first to ask Mr. Nobilo. You've mentioned the EU pillar within the NATO and the upcoming summit in Brussels. So what are the impacts of Brexit on the EU pillar within NATO? And the second one would be, what are the implications for EU and NATO cooperation after Brexit? I keep my question short as to, as Sandra always say, be rational with time. And the second one would go, the second question would go to Mr. Seibel and to Mr. Rhodes. We've mentioned many times that the EU and US cooperation is based on the rule-based order. So what the EU and the US can do to strengthen the rule-based order. Mr. Seibel, at the beginning of your presentation, you have mentioned the Ryanair case. So how to prevent such incidents in the future?
Yeah. Do you expect me to answer or first or yeah?
Yes, please, Mr. Nobilo.
Very briefly, I mean, we don't feel much or any change after Brexit in British role within NATO. On the contrary, I believe they are using more NATO than now when they are not anymore part of the EU to strengthen their international position. In a way, I would say that it's more France that is looking for autonomy of Europe than Britain within NATO. And I think that Brits are very vocal when it comes to strengthening transatlantic bonds, especially through NATO. Of course, Brexit puts them in a different position now when it comes to the military industry and PESCO and all the other projects where they were part of and where they have to redefine their relations in the future. But these issues will be resolved, especially with Britain and especially with the United States and Canada in the future. And I'm pretty confident that London would also have interest to be strongly linked with emerging existing European security structures.
Thank you. And now
Yes,
I would like to kindly ask Mr. Seibel to respond.
Yeah, thank you very much. So concerning rule-based order, acting on a rule-based order, what can be done to prevent such events like in Belarus from happening in the future? I'm not sure whether we'll be able to really prevent those events to take place and to happen. But as I mentioned, I think the European Union showed a very, very strong reaction to Belarus and the international community by unanimously and strongly condemning this event, and by deciding in a rather impressive period of time, short period of time, sanctions against the Russian president and the government. So this was, I think, a very good example of what can be done. The most important point, I think, for all of us who follow the rules, internationally rule-based order, the most important point is to find allies in what we are doing. So we defend core values of the not only the European Union or within the European Union. We defend core values which apply on the level of the United Nations and other formats as well. So there are a number. One of our main principles as Germany, and I think as European Union, is the key word multilateralism. And this is where we have to find our allies when we talk about values, defending values, and let's say strengthening rule of law and other principles of democracy. We have a certain number of formats where we can organize ourselves. We have the United Nations. There it is a bit difficult when it comes to issues related to areas, policy areas in which Russia, China are, let's say, more active. But we have the EU on the one hand, we have the G7 format, we have G20 format. So there are a number of formats which we can use to make the point and to find, as I said, allies in showing strong reaction to those people or to those governments who breach international law or who do not act according to international principles. So this would be my answer actually to that question.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Seibel. If you allow, I will have one question for Mr. Seibel and one question for Ambassador Nobilo. The question to Mr. Seibel: we are facing upcoming German and French elections, and regardless of the fact that by the book all member states are equal, as Orwell said, there are some animals that are more equal than others. So we are facing the elections in two leading, especially in the post-Brexit period, clearly two leading member states. My question to you is, what is your opinion? How will this affect the role of the EU in the world? Will there be more political will for tough compromises and synergy? As you said clearly in your presentation, EU has to speak with one voice. I mean, Brexit actually opened the window for opportunity during the fact that the Brits were always those who were skeptical towards growing synergy in the European security and defense, and now they're out. And now we have a clear leading axis in the EU. Will there be a possibility to reach more complex and complicated compromises that could potentially lead to strengthening of the EU's role in the world? And the question to Dr. Nobilo, along the lines of multilateralism as a key principle in contemporary international affairs, especially for a country like Croatia. We avoid mentioning the term small states, but obviously we are speaking about the state with limited capacity and geostrategic relevance. What are the challenges? We have listened to about the fact that we are facing different issues on NATO agenda. What are the challenges and how to promote Croatian role in the alliance, or how to build this clever topic-related coalitions to push for functional alliances and for topics that are, if not directly, then indirectly in Croatian national interest within this wider framework of multilateralism? Thank you.
So if I may start to answer the first question. I'm not sure whether the outcome of the elections in Germany, the federal elections, will change our, let's say, stand towards the European Union in general. The European Union will remain a focal point for German policy, regardless of who will be elected chancellor. So there's maybe one party which might put that into question, but I'm quite sure that they will not gain the majority on a federal level. All of the political parties in Germany stand behind the European Union, first of all. Secondly, I mean, Germany finds itself in a very difficult, sometimes in a very difficult position, I find. I mean, on the one hand, the member states expect Germany and France to be the motor of the European Union. On the other hand, we are very often criticized for taking that leading role. Of course, Germany, and I'm sure that applies to France as well. Germany is very much aware that the EU is changing. There are a lot of things going on within the European Union. And we certainly have to adapt to these. As a German, the German government will have to adapt to these changes going on. However, there's one thing which will not change. the European Union means one state, one vote. So in the very end, it is about convincing each other that the way or the proposal we make is the right one. Of course, also Germany needs to be ready to accept compromises, to take notice that other member states, and maybe smaller ones, if I may say so, have other ideas. But the most important thing is that within the European Union, we have a high standard of dialogue, and which very often comes to quite a reasonable end, I find. So if you have a look at what has been negotiated in 2020 during the Croatian and the German EU presidencies, there were a lot of issues which were very, very difficult to solve, and also Germany in the very end made compromises which were heavily criticized or contested by German Parliament. But what I want to say is that we are able to give in to what other member states propose. To come back to my remarks in the beginning, I think, and this is something the German politicians are really convinced of, as far as I noticed it. The most important thing is that the EU speaks out with one voice, and this is something we will always work for. And even if that means that Germany has to give in to other opinions and accept compromises which might be difficult to sell in Germany. So I'm quite optimistic that the Brexit actually, and the maybe stronger role of France and Germany within the European Union will not be detrimental to the Union as a whole.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Nobilo, please, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much. Briefly, I believe that smaller countries, they actually are more interested in upholding multilateralism because this is the only chance that they have. Big powers, they have other instruments, and of course, international order and certain rights can only for small countries be protected as a part guaranteed by the wider surrounding. And in that sense, when you are a member of an alliance like NATO and you are relatively small country, you have to express solidarity with others who do not have your national security priorities, but you have to prove yourself, your credibility on common cause. So you have to be present in the Baltic states, in enhanced foreign presence in Afghanistan, in Kosovo to serve the common purpose. But at the end of the day, Croatia's true security interest is stability of the Western Balkans, and not only because we had a war recently or we feel imminent threat from any neighboring countries, but the fact that the area had not settled, and particularly Bosnia and Herzegovina, with whom we share more than 1,000 kilometers of border, is an issue for us. We would like Bosnia to be more functional and try to bring them closer to Euro-Atlantic integration so that we have partners across the border on so many issues: security, migrations, economy, and all that. And in that sense, all those ideas of reshaping the borders in the Balkans are very dangerous, and we are fighting against it from the very beginning. But essentially, true interest of Croatia and true threats for us comes from the instabilities in Western Balkans, unfinished business there, and the fact that some, at least one country in the region acts as a proxy in the region, a kind of Belarus of the South, and we have to point to that and try to balance those out-of-region influences.
Thank you very much indeed. I believe that if we don't have any further questions, it's time to thank our panelists for generously sharing their thoughts and ideas. I found this panel very interesting. I learned a lot. I'm quite sure that the audience, whether people here live or people online, share the same idea. Thank you very much indeed. And I'm passing the floor to my colleague, Mrs. Markic-Boban, for closing remarks, please.
Thank you very much, Sandro, for your excellent moderation and comments. We are always happy to cooperate with you and with our dear partner, Institute for Development and International Relations. As today's discussion has also shown, the EU is facing cross-border challenges like COVID-19 pandemics, tensions and violence, which have been mentioned, financial crisis, climate change, migration crisis, cyber attacks, and so forth. So the question remains how to tackle these issues and to what extent collective action can be taken. As Joseph Borrell, EU High Representative, has said in his recent book, Europe's problem is not a lack of power, it is the lack of political will for the aggregation of its powers to maximize their impact. This relates to the issue raised at the beginning of our discussion, to what extent is the collective action possible and desirable. So I believe that the first point to be taken away from today's discussion is that the EU needs to clearly define its realistic ambitions for the future and to find broad support among its member states for collective action where possible, because unless you have a strategical direction and willingness to speak with one voice, which has also been reiterated many times here, and to act as one body, it will be very difficult to find means and ends to achieve the EU's strategic goals. The second point is that the cooperation between the EU and the US, which is based on shared history and democratic values, needs to be revived. This means, on the one hand, for the EU to strengthen its capacity to act, so as to be with the US on a more equal footing, and on the other hand, both for America and Europe, they should not only have high aims, but also the willingness to execute on them. And just a closing idea is that our goal as foundation is to promote the European project and values it is based on, and we will continue to do that also not only with our partners, but with this project on the future of Europe. On this note, I would like to thank all of you for being with us. I would like to thank our distinguished speakers, Mr. Nobilo, Mr. Seibel, Mr. Rhodes. Thank to all of us who have participated actively at today's conference. Big thanks to Mr. Fiesinger for joining our conference again, and hope to see you again soon on our next roundtable discussion. Thank you all.